They sold lake access to 70 families. The only problem is, that lake doesn't belong to them. It belongs to me. Yeah, let that sink in for a second, because I didn't even know it was happening until one random Saturday afternoon when a guy I'd never seen in my life pulled his pontoon boat right up to my dock, cut the engine like he owned the place, stepped out with a beer in his hand, and told me, no joke, to move my chair because we've got lake rights now. I actually laughed at first, like, I thought this was some kind of weird Ozarks humor or maybe he had the wrong shoreline. But then his wife chimed in from the boat, waving a brochure like it was a legal document, talking about Cedar Ridge Estate's private access amenities. And that's when something in my stomach just dropped. Because I've lived on that shoreline my whole life. My grandfather built that dock with his own hands. My great-grandfather dammed that creek back in 1934, turned a narrow valley into a lake that's been in our family ever since. So when a stranger tells you your own property suddenly belongs to a homeowners association, you don't just brush that off. You go quiet. You start connecting dots, and you realize, real fast, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is something bigger. So I told him, calm as I could, hey man, you might want to double-check that paperwork. And he just smiled at me, like I was the idiot, like I hadn't gotten the memo, and said, it's in our mortgage documents. We're good. Then sat down on my dock like we were neighbors sharing a beer, and that right there? That was the moment everything changed, because later that night, I pulled every single document my family had. Old deeds, permits, county filings, even brittle yellow papers from the 1930s, and I spread them out across my kitchen table like I was building a case against my own sanity. And what I found didn't just confirm my gut. It made things worse. The lake, private, always has been the dam, built and maintained by my family. The lakebed, deeded property, recorded clean and clear, riparian rights, never transferred, not once, which means no developer, no HOA, no smiling real estate agent gets to just include access like it's a pool in a gated community. But here's where it gets interesting. Cedar Ridge Estates, the development up on the bluff across the water. They never actually bought the lake. They bought the land above it, just high enough for a pretty view, just far enough to avoid the complicated legal stuff. And then they did what developers do best. They sold a dream, drone shots of my dock, my ramp, my shoreline, my family's property, edited into glossy marketing videos, captions like, exclusive lake lifestyle, private water access. You know, the kind of language that feels official but doesn't actually say anything concrete. And people bought it, dozens of them, families, retirees, folks cashing out their savings for a slice of quiet lake life. Except the lake life they thought they were buying? It wasn't theirs to begin with. And here's the part that really messes with your head. The developer knew. There's no way they didn't. You don't build a multi-million-dollar community without doing title research. You don't accidentally forget who owns an entire body of water. No, this was calculated. They sold the view and let buyers assume the rest. And assumptions, man, those are dangerous. Because once people believe something is theirs, they don't give it up easily. So the next morning, I drove down to the boat ramp. Our ramp, the only improved one on the lake. And sure enough, there were cars lined up, trailers backing in, people unloading kayaks, jet skis, coolers, like it was a public park, like the last 90 years of ownership just didn't exist. I sat there in my truck for a minute, watching it unfold, feeling this mix of anger and disbelief, like I'd somehow woken up in a version of reality where facts didn't matter anymore. And then one of them knocked on my window, this older guy, polite enough, but confident, too confident. And he says, hey, are you with the HOA too? And I just looked at him and said, no, I'm the reason this ramp exists. And you could see it hit him. Just a flicker, doubt creeping in. But then he shrugged it off, like most people do when reality starts poking holes in their expectations, because it's easier to believe the paperwork you signed than the guy standing in front of you. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to fix itself. So I did the only thing I could do. I called a lawyer, not some general practice guy. I'm talking water rights, property law, the kind of attorney who deals with disputes that go back generations. And I laid it all out, every document, every interaction, every red flag. And while I was waiting for him to get back to me, things escalated fast. More boats, more people, more attitude. One family even had the nerve to tie up overnight like it was a marina. And when I confronted them, They pulled out that same brochure again, pointing to pictures of my dock like it was evidence in court, and I remember thinking, this is what happens when marketing replaces truth, when a photo becomes a promise and nobody stops to ask who actually owns what. And then the threats started, little things at first, a note on my truck telling me to stop gatekeeping the lake. A couple of guys muttering under their breath when I walked by, nothing direct, nothing you can really act on. Just enough to let you know you're the problem now. You're the villain in their story, the guy ruining everyone's dream. And yeah, that gets to you, because I didn't ask for this. I didn't start this. I just happened to be the one holding the deed, and suddenly, that made me the enemy. But deep down, I knew something they didn't. The truth doesn't care how many people believe the lie, and sooner or later, reality catches up. I just didn't know how messy it was going to get before that happened. All right, let me pause the story for a second, because this is where things get really interesting, and honestly, a little dangerous if you don't understand how this stuff works. According to standard procedure, when you buy property in a development with an HOA, everything you actually own or have access to is spelled out in recorded documents. Deeds, plats, easements, not brochures, not marketing videos, not what the sales guy told you over a handshake. Those are just suggestions dressed up as promises. From a legal perspective, access to something like a lake isn't casual. It has to be explicitly granted, usually through a recorded easement or shared ownership structure. If it's not in the chain of title, it doesn't exist, period. And here's where people fall into trouble. This is a psychological trap. You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a home. You see pictures of a lake. You hear private access. Your brain fills in the blanks. It feels real. So you stop questioning it. And once that belief sets in, any challenge to it feels personal, like someone's taking something from you. Even if, legally, you never had it. And that's exactly what was happening here. Dozens of families weren't trying to steal anything. They genuinely believed they were entitled. And that belief, that's what turns a simple property dispute into a full-blown war. So about 2 weeks later, my attorney calls me back, and I can tell from his tone right away. This isn't going to be a gray area. This is one of those rare situations where the law is actually clean. He goes, "You're not just right. You're very right." And I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, because that should have felt like relief, but it didn't. It felt like the start of something. Because being right on paper doesn't mean anything if you're about to go up against dozens of angry homeowners who all think you're wrong. And he walks me through it. The deeds are intact. The lake bed is yours. The dam is yours. No recorded easements. No shared access agreements. Nothing, legally speaking. Every single one of those people stepping onto your dock or launching from your ramp. They're trespassing, plain and simple. And then he says something that stuck with me. This isn't just a property issue. This is a correction of a false narrative. And man, that hit. Because that's exactly what it felt like. Like I was about to walk into a story where I'd already been cast as the villain. So we drafted a certified letter. Not emotional, not aggressive. Just facts, clear, documented, undeniable. We sent it to the HOA board, copied their management company, even tracked down the developer's office. The message was simple. The lake, the dock, the ramp, and the dam are privately owned. Unauthorized use constitutes trespassing. Access is revoked effective immediately. And then I did the part that made it real. I drove down to the ramp with a length of heavy chain and a lock, the kind you don't cut without making a scene, and I shut it down. Posted signs too. Private property, no unauthorized access. Big, impossible to ignore, and for about, I don't know, maybe 24 hours, there was silence, like the whole place was holding its breath. And then it hit. Emails, calls, people showing up at my gate, some confused, some angry, some straight up hostile. One guy pounded on the fence yelling, "You can't just take away what we paid for." And I remember thinking, I didn't take anything. You were sold something that didn't exist. But try explaining that to someone who just moved their whole life based on that promise. And then the retaliation started getting more personal. My truck. Tires slashed in a Walmart parking lot. No cameras. No witnesses. Just 4 flat reminders that somebody out there took this real personally. My wife gets a call from a block number. Some guy breathing heavy into the phone saying, "You're gonna regret this," hangs up before she can say anything. And that changes the tone. Because now it's not just legal. It's personal. It's safety. It's your family. It's your kids asking why their friends' parents are suddenly acting weird. We stopped getting invited to neighborhood stuff. People we'd known for years suddenly acting like we crossed some line. And all of it, because I enforced something that had been true since 1934. But here's the thing. Pressure like that, it makes you question yourself. Even when you know you're right. There were nights I sat there thinking, maybe there's a way to just let it go, open it up, avoid the conflict. But then I'd look at those documents again, think about my great-grandfather building that dam by hand, my grandfather maintaining it, my dad teaching me how to fish off that dock, and I'd realize, if I give this up because it's uncomfortable, then what was the point of any of that? So when the lawsuit came, and yet, came, right on schedule, I wasn't surprised. The HOA filed against me, claimed implied access, argued that the marketing materials created a reasonable expectation of use, and honestly, on the surface, it sounds convincing, because in everyday life, we trust what we're shown. We assume good faith, but court isn't about assumptions, it's about records, and sitting there in that courtroom, listening to their attorney lay it out, talking about community reliance and shared understanding. I could feel how persuasive it might sound to someone who doesn't deal with property law, but then my attorney stands up, calm, precise, almost bored, and he just starts dismantling it piece by piece. No easement, no transfer of rights, no mention in any recorded document, and then he drops it. Your Honor, a brochure is not a deed, and a photograph is not an easement. And you could feel the shift in the room, like the air changed, because suddenly, all that emotional weight the HOA was leaning on, it just evaporated, and the judge, older guy, no patience for nonsense, he leans forward and says, almost casually, the court agrees. And just like that, it was over. Case dismissed, no long deliberation, no dramatic pause, just done. And then he adds, almost as an afterthought, if there was misrepresentation, the proper defendant would be the developer. And you could practically hear the gears turning on the other side of the room, because now the target had shifted, and a few months later. That's exactly what happened. The HOA turned around and sued the developer, and I stayed out of it, not my fight. I'd already fought mine. But here's where things take a turn you might not expect. About 6 months after the case got tossed, I get a call from the HOA board, different tone this time. No anger, no entitlement, just tired. Reality had set in. They knew what they had, and more importantly, what they didn't, and they asked to meet. So we sat down, me, a couple board members, their new attorney, and for the first time, it felt like an actual conversation instead of a standoff, and they laid it out. Look, our residents still want access. We understand now that it's your property. Is there a way to make this work? And I appreciated that, not because it fixed everything, but because it acknowledged the truth. So we worked through it, slowly, carefully, no shortcuts this time. Everything documented, everything clear. We landed on a lease agreement. 20 years, annual fee per household, adjusted for inflation, controlled access to the dock and ramp, and I kept what mattered: control of the dam, maintenance authority, the right to shut everything down during drought or repairs, because that's not just property, that's responsibility. And when we finally signed it, it felt quiet, not like a victory, not like a loss, just settled, like the dust finally came down after a long storm. And now, every summer, you see those same families out on the water, kids swimming, boats drifting, people laughing like nothing ever happened. And honestly, I don't mind it, because now it's real. Now it's honest. They're not taking something that isn't theirs, they're using something they understand, something they're part of. And every January, like clockwork, the HOA sends that check, and every time I open it, I can't help but think about how close this whole thing came to going a completely different way. Because at the end of the day, they sold the view, but I kept the water. So what do you actually take away from something like this? Because on the surface, it's easy to frame it as a win, right? Guy keeps his land. HOA gets humbled. Developer gets dragged into court somewhere down the line. Clean ending, satisfying. But real life's a little messier than that. Because if you zoom out, nobody really walked away untouched. Those homeowners? A lot of them bought into something they truly believed in, not because they were careless, but because the system encouraged that belief. Polished brochures, confident sales language, a sense of community already built before the first house was even finished. This is a psychological trap. You're not just buying property. You're buying identity, lifestyle, belonging, and once that emotional investment locks in, it becomes incredibly hard to question the foundation underneath it. You don't want to be the person who asks, wait, do we actually own this? Because that risks cracking the whole illusion, and developers, the smart ones anyway, they understand that. They know exactly how far they can push language without crossing into something explicitly illegal, just enough ambiguity to sell the dream, not enough clarity to guarantee it. And that's where things go sideways. According to standard procedure, everything that matters in real estate lives in recorded documents. Not marketing, not verbal assurances, not even what everyone says. If it's not written, filed, and attached to the title, it doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. And yeah, that sounds cold, but that's the system. Because without that level of precision, property rights would just dissolve into opinions. And trust me, you don't want that. From a legal perspective, what saved me wasn't luck, it was documentation, decades of it, clean records, consistent ownership, no gaps, no ambiguity. That's boring stuff. Until it's the only thing standing between you and losing everything. And here's the uncomfortable part. If even one of those documents had been off, one missing filing, one unclear transfer, this story could have gone the other way fast. I could have been buried in legal fees, dragged through years of litigation, maybe even forced into a settlement just to make the problem go away. Being right doesn't always mean you win. Being provably right? That's what matters. And then there's the HOA itself. And look, HOAs aren't inherently bad. They exist to maintain standards, protect property values, keep things organized, but they also concentrate authority. And when that authority is built on incorrect assumptions, it becomes a multiplier for conflict. Because now it's not just one person misunderstanding something. It's an entire group reinforcing that misunderstanding, validating each other, escalating together, and suddenly, you're not dealing with individuals anymore. You're dealing with momentum, and momentum is hard to stop, especially when pride gets involved, because nobody wants to admit they bought into something that wasn't real. Nobody wants to go back to their family and say, hey, that lake access we were excited about? Yeah, turns out we don't actually have it. So instead, they push forward, they double down, they look for someone to blame. And if you happen to be standing there holding the truth, congratulations, you just became the easiest target. And I felt that, not just legally, but socially. The silence, the tension, the subtle shift in how people treated us, that stuff doesn't show up in court records, but it's real, and it sticks with you. So yeah, I could sit here and say, the lesson here is, always check your documents. And that's true. You should, every single time, but it goes deeper than that. The lesson here is, don't outsource your understanding of reality. Not to a developer, not to an HOA, not even to the majority opinion around you. Because consensus doesn't equal truth. It just means more people are telling the same story, and sometimes that story is wrong. And if you're on the other side of that, if you're the one holding the inconvenient fact, you've got a choice to make. Do you stay quiet to keep the peace? Or do you stand on what you know is right and deal with the fallout? And I'm not going to pretend that's an easy choice. It's not. It costs you, in ways you don't always expect, relationships, comfort, that sense of being part of something. But it also clarifies things. It shows you what's real and what was just assumed. And maybe that's the bigger takeaway here. Clarity is expensive, but confusion costs more in the long run. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, whether it's property, contracts, anything where perception and reality might not line up, slow down, ask questions, get things verified. Don't let a nice view or a confident promise fill in the blanks for you. Because once those blanks get filled with assumptions, undoing them, that's where the real trouble starts. And hey, I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing, locked it down, taken the heat, gone through the fight? Or would you have just let it slide to keep the peace? Drop your thoughts below, because stories like this, they're not as rare as you'd think. And the line between right and easy, it's thinner than most people realize.